Take a moment right now. Pause before you scroll any further, because the fact that you landed on this today wasn't some accident or a random glitch in an algorithm. Something inside you was already searching for exactly this message, and somehow it found its way to you anyway. Maybe it wasn't a conscious search. Maybe you weren't sitting there thinking, I need to hear these exact words today. But somewhere beneath the surface there was a question you had been carrying. A feeling you couldn't fully explain. A pattern you kept noticing but couldn't put into words. And then, at the right moment, you came across something that finally gave language to what you had been experiencing. That's often how meaningful insights arrive. They don't always appear when we are looking for them directly. Sometimes they appear when we are finally ready to understand them. A conversation, a sentence, or a simple idea can suddenly connect pieces of an emotional puzzle that has been sitting unfinished for a long time. Maybe you've been trying to understand why someone pulled away when things started becoming deeper. Maybe you've questioned whether their distance meant they never cared, or whether there was something happening internally that you couldn't see. Maybe you've been searching for clarity because the silence, the mixed signals, or the emotional confusion left you carrying questions that never received answers. And perhaps this message reached you because a part of you already knew there was something deeper happening beneath the surface. Not because you had all the answers, but because your intuition recognized that the story was more complicated than it appeared. Sometimes we spend so much time trying to understand another person's behavior that we forget to understand our own emotional experience. We analyze their actions, their words, their disappearances, and their returns. We search for explanations because uncertainty can feel heavier than the truth itself. But the moment we begin seeing patterns clearly, something shifts inside us. We stop chasing confusion and start choosing awareness. The purpose of understanding these dynamics is not to give someone else control over your emotions. It is to help you reclaim your own. Awareness is not about predicting every move another person will make. It is about recognizing what you deserve, what you need, and what kind of connection allows you to feel valued rather than constantly uncertain. Sometimes the message we need arrives at the exact moment we are ready to stop asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" and start asking, "What can I learn from this, and how do I move forward with greater understanding?" Maybe this found you because you are at a point where something inside you is changing. A point where you are no longer looking for someone else to complete the missing pieces. A point where you are learning that peace, self-respect, and emotional clarity are not things someone gives you. They are things you build within yourself. And once you begin seeing relationships through that lens, everything starts to look different. The silence has meaning. The patterns become clearer. The lessons become easier to recognize. What once felt like confusion becomes information. Sometimes the message finds you because, in some quiet way, you were already ready to hear it. So stay here with me for just a little while longer. I want you to picture this particular person in your mind right now. Let their face come into focus clearly, and pay attention to what happens in your body the moment it does. Notice that gentle tug in your chest, that mixture of warmth, longing, and something you can't quite put words to. That sensation isn't confusion. That's your heart recognizing something your logical mind is still trying to catch up with. Because this person didn't just wander into your life by pure chance. On some deeper level, some part of you already knows them, already understands them, in a way that goes beyond how long you've actually known each other in real time. And I understand how draining it can feel to carry a love this enormous when everything surrounding it still feels so unresolved and uncertain. All those nights spent lying awake, holding this feeling quietly to yourself, wondering if you're reading too much meaning into small signs, wondering if any of it truly matters in the grand scheme of things. It matters more than you know. You are not being naive. You are not being overly emotional or dramatic. You are someone standing right in the middle of something that is going to turn out to be deeply meaningful. And that is exactly why it feels this hard right now. What makes connections like this so powerful is that they don't just skim the surface of who we are. They reach directly into the parts of ourselves we've spent years trying to manage, hide, or simply survive around. A lot of people assume love is supposed to feel like relief, like finally reaching calm water after years of struggling to keep your head above the surface. But the connections that actually transform us tend to arrive more like a storm before they ever bring calm. They loosen everything that's been buried underneath years of coping mechanisms, emotional armor, pride, fear, and old survival instincts. And at first, that unsettling can feel a lot more like falling apart than like growing into something new. When someone steps into your life and reaches places no one else has ever been able to touch, your usual defense mechanisms simply stop functioning the way they used to. The person who has always given too much, who has always overextended themselves, finally starts to realize just how exhausted they are from constantly having to prove their own worth and sacrifice their own needs along the way. They start questioning why they ever believed that closeness needed to be earned through endless emotional effort and patience. That realization is painful because it forces them to confront the uncomfortable truth that somewhere along the way they were taught that love isn't simply guaranteed for existing as they are. Meanwhile, the other person is confronting an equally frightening reality of their own, one built around having survived by staying emotionally out of reach. For them, closeness has become tangled up with old pain, betrayal, or loss, so much so that their nervous system now treats real intimacy like a threat to be avoided. They pull back, not because the connection lacks meaning to them, but because the intensity of what they're feeling becomes too overwhelming to sit with. From the outside, it looks like an imbalanced situation, one person chasing while the other retreats and seems overwhelmed by it all. But underneath the surface, what's actually happening is two wounded people responding differently to the exact same fear, the fear of being rejected, the fear of never being enough. The one doing the pursuing believes somewhere deep down that love will vanish without constant effort to maintain it, which makes silence feel unbearable to them. But they eventually have to learn that abandoning themselves is too steep a price to pay for any connection. Their worth was never meant to be measured by how much emotional pain they're willing to absorb for someone else's sake. Even when everything feels completely stuck right now, the person who pulls away is often carrying the opposite wound. Somewhere inside them lives a belief that if someone gets too close, they'll eventually lose themselves entirely, disappoint the person they care about, or end up feeling emotionally trapped. So instinctively, the moment things start to feel real, they create distance. Yet that distance rarely brings them the peace they're seeking. More often, it brings guilt, confusion, loneliness, and an even sharper awareness of exactly how much they actually care underneath it all, because avoiding real openness protects them from rejection temporarily, but it also blocks them from receiving the very love they secretly long for. Healing is rarely elegant in its early stages. Sometimes it looks like confusion. Sometimes it shows up as inconsistency, fear, emotional overwhelm, or long stretches of silence while someone works through understanding themselves on a deeper level. Growth tends to look messy long before it starts to look wise. Think about a caterpillar. It literally dissolves inside its cocoon before it ever becomes something new. Transformation has always required a kind of ending first, not a literal ending, but the ending of old identities, old defenses, and old beliefs that simply cannot survive inside something deeper and more real. That's exactly why these kinds of connections can feel almost unbearable at certain points. They expose contradictions within us. They reveal just how badly we want closeness, while simultaneously showing us just how afraid we are of it. They force us to face the difference between attachment and genuine love. Attachment says, "Please don't leave, because I need you to complete something that feels missing inside me." Genuine love eventually says, I want to fully know you while also learning how to stay whole within myself, and that distinction changes absolutely everything. But here's the part I really need you to hear clearly, because this is the piece most people completely miss. In every one of these connections, there's a turning point, and it doesn't arrive through some dramatic moment or a long overdue heart-to-heart conversation. It doesn't happen because they finally say the exact words you've been hoping to hear. It happens because of a quiet decision you make internally, a decision to stop waiting to be chosen and to start genuinely choosing yourself instead. And when that internal shift takes place, something in the entire dynamic begins to shift with it. Not because love operates like some kind of magic trick, but because whatever energy you're bringing into the space between two people, it lands somewhere, it has an effect. When you stop reaching towards someone from a place of fear or need, you stop being the thing they feel an urge to move away from. And for maybe the first time, they're left sitting alone with what they actually feel about you, not what they're afraid of, not what they've been avoiding, but what's genuinely there underneath it all. And what's there has never actually disappeared. I want you to trust that on a deep level. Let me be completely honest with you about something, and I need you to actually sit with this instead of skimming past it quickly. Everything you've endured throughout this waiting period, every single moment of it, has meant something important. Not 1 second has been wasted. I know it might feel that way sometimes. I know there are moments where you look back at all the love you've poured out and wonder if it simply disappeared into thin air, if it landed anywhere meaningful at all, if any of it was even worth the effort. But here's what's actually true. Love doesn't just vanish into nothing. It doesn't go nowhere. Every quiet evening spent thinking about someone who isn't physically beside you, every night you've fallen asleep holding feelings with nowhere to go, none of that has been in vain. That love is real, and it's actively shaping and deepening you into someone capable of holding something genuinely extraordinary once it finally arrives. When you cry because something that feels so right is also causing you so much pain, that's never a sign of weakness or fragility. Those tears are simply your heart refusing to abandon something it recognizes as sacred. That's a rare and remarkable kind of faithfulness. Most people, when things get this hard and uncertain, find a reason to walk away, protecting themselves before they can be hurt any further. It would have been so easy for you to shut down, build a wall, and decide that loving this deeply simply cost too much. So many people get hurt or left waiting long enough that eventually they go quiet and close themselves off entirely because the price starts to feel too high to keep paying. You had every reason to make that same choice, and honestly, nobody would have blamed you for it. And yet, you stayed open when closing yourself off would have been so much easier. You stayed soft when hardening was sitting right there as the simpler option. In a world that constantly rewards being guarded and emotionally detached, your refusal to take that route is actually a form of quiet strength, not a weakness or vulnerability to be ashamed of. Loving completely without calculating what you'll get back in return is an incredibly rare quality, and it happens to be exactly the kind of foundation that lasting love gets built on. You chose to stay, to feel, to keep caring, even when everything around you was practically handing you a reason to walk away. And that matters more than you realize. Loving someone through confusion, through distance, through entire seasons where nothing feels clear and the silence stretches on, and doing all of that without becoming bitter along the way, that takes something that simply cannot be faked, and it cannot be learned secondhand from watching someone else do it. You either carry that capacity within you, or you don't, and you do carry it. That's not a small or insignificant thing about who you are. In fact, it might be one of the most important things about you, and it's precisely that quality that's leading you somewhere real, somewhere solid, not toward a relationship that keeps you permanently off balance, always trying to read between the lines, always wondering exactly where you stand, always bracing yourself for the next wave of uncertainty. Not toward a love that makes you feel like your emotions are simply too much for the space you've been given to occupy. You're being led towards something that actually fits, something that doesn't require you to shrink yourself down or dim any part of who you genuinely are. A love that feels like the deep breath you finally get to take after holding tension in your chest for far too long. That's not poetic exaggeration for effect. That is genuinely where this is heading. So, what does that actually look like in real, practical terms? What do you do today, tomorrow, and in the days that follow with everything I've just shared? Here's the most important part, and the most difficult one too, and I'm not going to soften it just to make it sound easier than it really is. You turn toward yourself deliberately, consciously, with genuine intention. Not as some performance of moving on, not as a tactic or a way of playing a long game to get a certain result. Genuinely and honestly, you redirect the energy you've been pouring outward and you bring it back home to yourself. You start asking yourself a question you may not have asked in a very long time, a question that might feel almost unfamiliar in your own mouth. What do I actually need right now? Not what do they need? Not what could I say or do or become that might shift something between us? Not what would bring them back or open them up or finally make them understand. What do you need? What would genuinely feel good to you today? What part of your own life have you been quietly neglecting because your attention was so consumed by something that always felt just out of reach? You start filling those neglected places back in. You start saying yes to yourself with at least a fraction of the enthusiasm you've been offering everyone else. The things you kept putting off because you were waiting for life to feel more settled first, you start doing some of those things now. The friendships you let quietly drift because your emotional energy was consumed elsewhere, you start reaching back out to some of those people. The parts of yourself you set aside because you were so absorbed in this one situation, you take them back down off the shelf and dust them off. None of this means pretending the love isn't real or isn't there. None of it is about forcing yourself to feel something you don't actually feel, or forcing yourself to stop feeling something you do. It's simply about expanding your life back out to its full size, so you're no longer living inside a small space built entirely around one person and one possible outcome. And here's what happens when you genuinely start doing this work. Something shifts in the way you carry yourself. It's not some dramatic overnight transformation. It's quieter than that, but it's absolutely real. You stop feeling like an unfinished sentence waiting on someone else to write its ending. You stop feeling like you're stuck in a permanent holding pattern, like your life can't fully begin until this one particular situation resolves itself. You start feeling like a whole person again, someone whose life carries weight, color, and forward momentum, regardless of what any single relationship is or isn't doing at the moment. And that feeling, that sense of groundedness, that sense of being rooted in your own existence rather than suspended somewhere in someone else's uncertainty, it changes the way you show up in the world. People around you can feel it, even if they couldn't put it into words themselves. There's a certain quality to someone who is genuinely at home within themselves, and it's magnetic in the truest sense of the word. It draws things toward it instead of having to chase anything down. And the person you've been loving through all of this, they will feel that shift too, more than anyone else around you. I want to be really clear that this isn't a strategy. The last thing I want is for you to hear any of this as some kind of technique designed to produce a specific outcome. It isn't that. It's simply the truth of what naturally happens when someone stops relating to another person from a place of lack and starts relating instead from a place of genuine fullness. The whole dynamic breathes differently when that shift happens. There's suddenly room for something authentic to unfold that couldn't have existed before. Now I want to take a moment to talk about them, because I think there's something you might need permission to fully understand. They are not the villain in any of this. I know there have probably been moments where the hurt made it tempting to cast them that way, where the distance, the silence, or the inconsistency made you want to construct a cleaner story where someone is obviously in the wrong. But they are not a cold person. They are not simply indifferent to you or what you share. What you've been reading as distance is actually something far more complicated underneath the surface. It's someone who, somewhere along the way, usually long before you ever entered their life, came to understand love as something dangerous, something that costs more than they can afford to pay, something that opens them up to a level of pain that doesn't feel worth the risk. They didn't consciously decide any of this. No one ever does. It gets built into a person through experiences that shape them long before they're even old enough to name what's actually happening to them. So what looks to you like them pulling away is, in reality, them quietly managing a fear that has been with them for a very long time, one that predates you entirely. They think about you in the spaces between distractions, in the quiet moments when there's nothing left to avoid what's actually happening inside them. You're present there. They feel the absence of your energy, even in the very moments when they're the ones who created that absence in the first place. There's a tension that lives in them around you that doesn't simply disappear just because they've stepped out of contact, because what they're actually feeling isn't really about closeness or distance at its core. It's about something much deeper that they haven't finished working through yet, and that unfinished work isn't yours to complete for them. You genuinely cannot do it for them, no matter how badly you want to, no matter how clearly you can see exactly what they need, no matter how much love you're willing to offer as a pathway through it. That is their road to walk, and theirs alone. What you can do, the one truly powerful thing available to you in this situation, is refuse to let their fear write the story of your worth. Refuse to absorb their unresolved pain as if it were evidence of something lacking in you. Hold yourself with such genuine dignity and such steady love that when they do eventually move through whatever has been holding them back, what they find waiting is you at your absolute fullest, not made smaller from all the waiting, not emptied out from all the longing, not desperate for validation you should have been giving yourself the entire time. Instead, standing fully in your own light, grounded, whole, and genuinely ready. Close your eyes for just a second and picture a morning that's closer than you might think. You wake up, and the first thing you notice is that the weight is gone. That particular heaviness that's been sitting in your chest for so long, you'd almost stop noticing it was even there. It's simply not there anymore. Not because your feelings vanished, not because you stopped caring about this person, and not because you forced yourself into some artificial state of detachment. It's gone because the love finally has somewhere to live, because what was once unresolved has finally found resolution. Because the thing that was always meant to happen has happened, and it's no longer sitting somewhere out in the future, waiting to become real. It simply is real now. Picture turning and looking at this person, really looking at their face and seeing something there you haven't seen before, or haven't seen in a very long time, not the hesitation. Not the internal conflict behind their eyes, not that particular quality of someone who is physically present but emotionally held back somewhere deep inside. Instead, you see peace, the quiet, settled peace of someone who has made a complete choice and isn't second-guessing it, isn't managing it carefully, isn't holding anything back anymore. Someone who is simply there with you, fully and completely. Imagine what it would feel like to have a love that doesn't visit your thoughts at 2 a.m. as a source of anxiety, where you're not lying awake turning things over and over in your mind, searching for what you missed or what you should have said differently, or what might be coming next. A love where your nervous system actually gets to rest, where you're no longer constantly watching for signals or bracing yourself for disappointment or preparing for an uncertainty that never seems to fully go away. A love where the question of whether you're enough simply isn't a question anymore, not because you finally managed to convince someone of your worth, but because you're with someone for whom your value was never in question to begin with, where you're seen completely, all the complicated, layered parts of who you are, the parts you're proud of and the parts you're still actively working on, and chosen for every bit of it, not in spite of it, but because of it. That isn't a story you invented simply to comfort yourself through a hard season. That is the natural destination for two people who each took their own healing seriously, who stopped arriving in each other's lives carrying old wounds and old fears while expecting the other person to somehow fix what life had broken in them, and who instead came together as people who had done enough of their own inner work to be genuinely available for something real. That is what's being built right now, in the middle of this uncertainty, this difficulty, this waiting that feels endless. Every single day you choose to take care of yourself instead of dissolving into worry. You lay down another piece of the foundation for a love that lasts. Don't let the difficulty of this middle stretch convince you that your destination isn't real. The middle is always the hardest, most uncertain part, the part where it's genuinely difficult to hold on to your sense of direction. But this stage is entirely temporary, and it has an end point, whereas the true love you're moving toward does not. You are not late, you are not broken, and you are not behind. You are exactly where you need to be, becoming exactly who you need to become, for the love that is already making its way toward you.